Hi, I'm Matt Shardlow. I'm an entomologist and invertebrate conservationist, and we're here today at Bedford Purlieus Wood looking at the wood ants. We've found a nest already, so we're going to go and have a look at a great big wood ants nest just over here. See what they're up to today. Well, they're quite active, as you can see. On the top of the nest here, we've got this almost like a little dark cap, which is actually the bodies of lots of ants. And interestingly today, there's not only the little worker ants running around, but on the top we can see queens. So queen ants with their wings, young queens. These are probably virgin queens that have not yet mated. They will fly up from the nest maybe today, if the weather's warm enough, who knows. Find a male, mate, and then land again and build a nest of their own. So in the nest we've got hundreds and thousands of ants. There might be 250,000 ants in this one nest. Most of the ants are worker ants, and they're female ants built to a standard. They've got no wings. They're quite big, as you can see, and they have different roles within the nest and outside the nest. So in the nest, some of those workers will be looking after the eggs or looking after the queen. Others will be bringing in sticks to build up the nest. Others will be going out and foraging, and that can be hunting and it can be tending aphids, which is how this colony gets all its energy. Also in the nest you've got queens and you've got the males, the drones. The queens and the drones have a limited, well, the drones have a very limited role. They just basically have to mate with a female. The queens don't have any duties in the nest, but they come out and they fly, and then obviously the queens will start the new nests going and get the new colonies up and running. It's a polygynous species, this, which means that the queens that leave the nest often won't go very far at all. They may only go a few metres and start their own little nests, and they all become interlinked. So what you end up in the wood is not sort of just individual nests, but a network of big nests and little nests with the related ants all doing the same sort of thing and all working together to form a big community of ants on the floor of the forest, and then going up into the trees to forage on the aphids, which they protect and look after in the trees, and then bring that honeydew back down into the nests where it provides the energy that this massive organism needs to survive.
So talking about the way that the ants spread, these are obviously a native species and they're well known for being in Bedford Purlieus, but there are other fragments of Rockingham Forest in the area, such as Wakeley Woods or Fineshade. Can you explain how it would be that those ants haven't set colonies up in the neighbouring forests?
Yeah, sure. So this is the southern wood ant. As the name suggests, it doesn't go very far north, and we're at the northern edge of its distribution here in Bedford Purlieus, and that means that it may never have been very widespread and abundant around here. We know that John Clare, the poet, 200 years ago, who lived in Helpston, which isn't very far away from here, he was writing about ants, big black ants in the woods, dragging across the sticks to form the piles. That strongly suggests that 200 years ago, the local people were familiar with there being wood ants around the place. Whether they were in this wood, we don't really know. And even if they were in this wood, they may not have been in a lot of other woods. Over time, there have been things that have driven wood ants to extinction in a number of sites. For instance, there's a site over near Northampton where they used to live, which is now a quarry. So there's no space there for the ants anymore, and they've gone extinct. So different reasons they can go extinct. They can be dug up in a quarry, or the trees may be removed so there'll be no aphids for them to survive on, or the trees may become too dense, so there's not actually enough sunlight coming through to the ground levels to keep them warm enough for this southern species to survive. So there's a number of reasons why, even if you have wood ants in your wood, you might have lost them, or they can go extinct. These are quite sensitive species, and they're not easy to necessarily sustain on sites.
So, Matt, how long do you think that these wood ants have actually been in Bedford Purlieus?
Well, to some extent we don't really know. So We haven't got records going back in this wood for a very long time, back to the 1970s. People were recording them. There was a big survey and they counted all the nests in the wood. Maybe they got here naturally after the glaciers went. They came up north and they found the woods in this area and found them to their liking. It's also possible they were introduced either to this wood from other nearby woods or from further away. And that might have been done in the 1800s by gamekeepers wanting to feed the pheasants. So it's possible that in some of these woods where we get them, they've actually been introduced in the dim and distant past. We just don't really know. What we do know is obviously with climate change, that's pushing the distribution that the species could be and should be living in further north. So it's making more areas suitable. But we talked a bit about the queens coming up and then landing nearby. They just don't disperse very far away. This species, the southern wood ant, isn't a big disperser. So a queen is unlikely to fly more than 500 metres perhaps after she's mated, before she sheds her wings and starts a colony on the ground. That means that all the woods around here that are also fragments of the old Rockingham Forest are all too far away. So this species is very unlikely to ever get out of this wood and get into other woods, because there's no corridor of woodland for them to move along to get to that wood. So wood ants form a big organism, not just one nest but lots of nests potentially throughout the area. They're going up into the trees and having relationships with aphids, so they're looking after the aphids, farming them, taking the nectar. And there's several species of aphid that they'll be favouring. So for instance on maples there are some aphids that they look after and others that they hunt. So they have quite a formative impact on the fauna and the other species living around them. They're predators, so that has an impact on life in the forest floor as well. But also they form food for lots of things. So they form food for birds, for small mammals, for lizards, for all sorts of other things that might be living in this wood as well. But it doesn't just stop there. There's actually in Europe about 250 species of other invertebrates that live within the ant's nest. And that's things like little mites, springtails, beetles. There's lots of beetles that are living in these sorts of nests. Some of these things are parasitic, so they may be feeding on young. Most of them have some sort of role in the nest, so they may be cleaning up, or they may be keeping down levels of other organisms. Knowing what's in that nest is quite important, because if the nests in this wood have lots of other species living in them, that suggests that this is a long-lived community that's been here for a long time. Whereas if these ants have been just recently, in the last 100 years or so, introduced, you might expect fewer of the other species to be living here, because they haven't found their way to this wood, because they've got the same dispersal challenges in terms of finding the nests and finding the woods that the ants themselves have. So there's all sorts of things living in here. We might just go and have a little look and see if we can find something in there. Let's just have a look in here, see what we can find. Well, here we've got a queen running around here with its wings out. Another queen there. The drones might be around as well, they're a bit smaller. Lots of ants, as you can see, and their movement makes it quite hard to spot other things. Sometimes there's some beetles, for instance, that live in the nest that move very slowly. And it's almost as if the ants, with their fast movingness, can't really see these slow moving organisms. So sometimes it can be quite hard to spot things. There's little ants as well that make little nests, tiny ants that make tiny nests within the wood ant colony. I'm not seeing anything. Oh look, here's a little, there we go. This is a little staphylinid beetle here. A staphylinid is one of the commonest sorts of organisms in here. There's one there, and that might be some of them are predators of the eggs in the ant's nest. Here's a little snail. I suspect that's just been brought to the nest and used as part of the material for the nest rather than actually living in the nest. It looks pretty dead to me. They don't seem very happy about us doing this. And there's several species of those little road beetles, so I don't know which one it is. They're very similar.
So some of the ants seem to be pointing their abdomen at you in a rather aggressive manner. Can you explain that behaviour, Matt?
Yeah, so that they're spraying formic acid at us. So formic acid basically means ant acid, and they're using this as a defence mechanism. So this is, it's a toxic chemical actually. Don't want too much of it, and it's pungent. It gets in your nostrils, and it's going to put off a lot of predators that might be coming to here to feed on the ants or to take advantage of their reserves. Formic acid is also useful to blackbirds and other birds who will sometimes come down onto the nests and do what's called anting, which is where they open up their wings and sit on top of the ants' nest. This behaviour is thought to keep down the levels of parasites birds have. The smell that we're getting now of the formic acid is quite strong, so I think I'm going to put them back. We found one little inquiline in there, the little thing living in the nest, that little rove beetle. You'd have to do a lot more of this to work out what exactly is in these nests, because obviously, one little handful isn't going to tell you a lot. But there we go. There's other things in that nest we found, so that's good. I'm going to put them back now.
Barrie Galpin, who's part of the Rockingham Forest Vision project, has mooted the idea of potentially translocating some of the ants here into some of the other fragments of Rockingham Forest. Can you just talk a little bit about what would be the prerequisites to doing that and a little bit about the process itself?
Well, there have been attempts to relocate ants' nests in the past, not just this species, but some of the northern ant species, the hairy wood ant, for instance. Often it's to try to move them out of the way of development. So we've had a few instances where a local authority has approved a development on a site with wood ants, but as part of that scheme, the developer has to move the ants out of the way and put them somewhere else. And moving those nests from a site, it doesn't work very well. Some of them are likely to survive, but probably 90% of those colonies won't live for a very long time. So it's not a very effective way of moving them around. One can also take queens, mated queens, and use them to start little colonies yourself, so that people can do that in their homes, and then take those colonies and move them to a site. I guess one of the challenges is that these are ecosystem forming species, so effectively these wood ants are creating an ecosystem around themselves here, and just bringing some small numbers of ants into a new site may or may not work. They may or may not be able to convert that wood into a wood ant friendly place for them to be. So there are some uncertainties about that. That doesn't necessarily mean that one shouldn't try. These species are in trouble because they can't disperse from one place to another, and if they can't get there, and if we can't create the habitat quickly enough to enable those species to move from A to B, then maybe, particularly in light of climate change, which is pushing these species or wanting to push these species further north, maybe facilitating that movement, moving those to sites where they could have their positive impact, that impact where they bring in all those other species into the ecosystem, or they help shape the ecosystem, create that diversity. Maybe that is a really good idea, and maybe we should look at other places where these ants could go to, and whether those other sites are suitable. So whenever you're doing that sort of introduction, there's two questions. Is the source population healthy? Is there the capacity for it to take queens and other nests maybe out of that site and put them somewhere else? And is the other site reasonably suitable for those ants as well? So those are the two main criteria to think about when looking at sort of introductions around nests.
And just tell me, Matt, a little bit about how we can assess the health of the population here and what we know about how healthy it was in the past.
Well, we've got one good survey from this wood, which was in 1974, when they covered the whole wood and looked very carefully at where the colonies were and mapped them. So we've got a map showing where all of the colonies were in 1974, and there were 155 colonies of the ants. Not always clear, obviously, whether they're independent colonies or small nests linked with big nests, but 155 nonetheless found all around this wood. So taking that to be, a healthy population at that time, repeating that survey, preferably using the same methodology, would be a really good way to assess whether these ants here were in a healthy condition. There are other tools we could use now that weren't available in the 1970s. You could look at the genetics. So by looking at the genetics of the ants in this wood, you could look at how interrelated they are. You could look at actually how many separate colonies or separate lines there are, or are they all interrelated? If they're all closely related, does that mean that the ants came here by one female or a small number of females, a couple of nests being put in the wood by a gamekeeper? If it's more diverse, and you get more of the inquilines, the species living in there, that might indicate a longer residence in the area, that the species may have been here for thousands of years and that this is just the last remnant of place where they're living. The nearest site to here where they are is currently 30 miles away. So how related are these ants to those ants 30 miles away? Maybe they're closely related to those other ants, which again would suggest a local providence. Maybe they are related to ants living in Dorset now. And actually, we could use their genetics not only to see whether this population is healthy, but maybe to understand a bit more about where it's come from, its history, and how it might operate in another wood if these ants were then taken and put into those other woods. So hopefully, we've covered a bit of the ecology of these wood ants and, illustrated how these ants form such an important part of our woodlands, supporting other species, interacting with the aphids, seed dispersal, birds anting on the hills. They really enrich these woods and they're an important part of our biodiversity. But like so much of it, isolated and threatened in the modern landscape by agriculture, by woods being chopped down, by woods being mismanaged. So it's really important that we get these species on a firm, stable footing and that we don't allow them to go extinct. And in the long term, if we can't link up those woods and we can't make that ecological network work again, we do need to start thinking about whether we need to move species like this wood ant or these nests. If you move the nest, you also move the things living in that nest with them to other sites so that other woodlands also have that full ecological array of species and habitats in those woods. Wood ants are a real ecosystem engineer and a real important part of British woodlands.
Aren't ants amazing little creatures? It was fascinating watching them going about their business around the colony. And if you found today's episode interesting and you want to learn more about Rockingham Forest and wood ants and other exciting projects, I suggest you check out the Rockingham Forest Vision website, where you can learn a bit more about what's going on here and maybe become a little more connected with the ancient forest that surrounds us all. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. Please consider sharing it and check out the rest of the videos on my channel if you find this sort of thing interesting. Thanks.